Hi, this is Paul. As I've said in a bunch of previous videos, I had a little bit of time away, haven't made too many videos lately. I've had a little bit of time to reflect. It was a little over 2 years ago that I began studying the work of Jordan Peterson and trying to figure this out. And with time, you begin to see more things and figure more things out. And so I want to do a video on understanding the Jordan Peterson phenomenon in the light of the meaning crisis. Now, I Forrest Gumped my way into YouTube land at the end of November 2017, and I had been watching Jordan Peterson's videos and trying to figure out what on earth is going on around him. Why are all of these atheists getting interested in the Bible and Christianity? Why are people starting to go to Orthodox churches? Who is this Jonathan Peugeot guy? I couldn't even say his name at first, and he didn't even have any salt and pepper in his beard like he has now, and what on earth is going on? And so I start making YouTube videos, and people start watching my videos, and they start writing to me, and I start a meetup, and people start coming to the meetups, and I'm having conversations with all kinds of new people about all sorts of different things. I learned about psychedelics, something I hadn't given any thought to at all. On and on and on and on. This whole thing kind of turns my world upside down, and I've been Forrest Gumping my way through it the whole time. I go to Australia and I do a conference, and the first I don't have versions 2. I don't have lectures 2 and 3 yet. This isn't my fault. Warren has to get me these things, and Warren has some challenges with big video files, and so hopefully I'll get talks 2 and 3 out at some point, and I'll be able to put them out on the channel. But I was preparing for the Australia talks. I began to notice the pattern of how many of the individuals that I had spoken with told me about how they were suffering from depression and anxiety. And how, watching Jordan Peterson, this really was relieved. And this is something that took me completely by surprise. How can watching some videos about a Canadian psychologist talk for 2+ hours about the Bible and Jung and monkeys and paint paint sap and tickling rats, and how can any of this have to help people with depression and anxiety? But it did. And then people started going to church, and I'm like, what on earth is going on with this business? And so I've still spent the last 2 years just trying to get my mind around all of this crazy stuff. Last year I had a really good conversation. I should probably do another one soon too with Alistair Roberts, who's just a brilliant theologian out of the UK. He travels quite a bit in the US, and we had a conversation, and I thought the conversation was really good, and I expressed some of my anxiety about this Peterson moment's going to slip away, and he really hit a nerve, and then there was a media hit job on him, and he got tangled up in the culture war, and everybody's been waiting for him to continue the biblical series, but there have been health problems in his family, and I was expressing anxiety about that. And Alistair said, well, don't give it too much concern, because the stuff that has brought this moment isn't going away. And so the issues that have fueled a lot of what I see as good things about the Jordan Peterson moment, these things aren't going away. And Alistair Roberts, I mean, this if you haven't paid any attention to Alistair Roberts, the guy is just flat out brilliant. Every time I listen to him, it's like I got to put have to lift my jaw, because I listen to him talk. It's like, dude, how smart can someone be? But every time I listen to him, it's like amazing. But he said that, and I thought, he's right. I gotta stop worrying about that. Along the way, Struan, who lives in South Africa, this guy starts sending me emails, and he doesn't have a webcam, but so we do Zoom chats, but he doesn't want to be on the channel. You can find him now in the new Discord server that we have. The link for that is below, and you can find him on Reddit, and you can find him on Twitter. And Struan just sends me these emails, and he's just demanding, I've got to watch this course, Buddhism and Cognitive Science. And I'm thinking, I'm not into Buddhism. That's not my thing. And most of the time, I don't really sit and watch videos. I mostly listen to videos. I have an Android phone, and YouTube Red really plays YouTube fairly well. Or sometimes I'll just rip videos off of YouTube into MP3s so I can listen to them while I drive in the car, or I'm doing grocery shopping for the family, or I'm washing dishes, or I'm, all kinds of ways that I listen to the content that I listen to. And the sound was awful, but there were some interesting ideas. I thought, well, this is sort of interesting. And then, of course, John Vervaeke starts a new series, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And first I couldn't say his name. And then I saw some of these videos from Think Big Animation that were taking some of his ideas, and they were making some, really cool shorter videos about it. And I thought, wow, some of this stuff is really making sense. And John Vervaeke had a conversation with Jonathan Peugeot, and then he had a conversation with Benjamin Boyce, who I thought that was a great conversation. I keep picking up tidbits from him, and then I start really diving into his meaning crisis videos. And then and there's so many interesting things. And again, I love getting the free philosophy lectures and the free lectures about cognitive science. I love all that. But that his project is slowly dawning on me, and then he's doing some other conversations with some other people, and he's talking about the project, and it's just slowly fitting into my mind. James Lindsay said something to Benjamin Boyce, which I heartily agree. Not with respect to him, but with respect to me. You just don't realize how dim you are until you start watching yourself learning, and you think, gosh, how slow am I to learn this stuff? Why wasn't I paying attention when I first saw this stuff? I didn't know. So the meaning crisis stuff just starts to bubble up. And just recently, I'm gonna go hop a little bit ahead. Some of my favorite, C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, two of my favorite authors. I didn't see the issues. And just after I started doing videos, someone said, oh, you got to read Joseph LeConte's A Hobbit, a Wardrobe, and a Great War. And I'd been interested in World War I and World War II for a long time. I was a history major in college, and I've always loved 20th century history. And that book just sort of said, hey, wait a minute. The First World War is behind this. And then I discover Owen Barfield, and things just start coming together. What is this? What is the warm water that was beneath the hurricane that Jordan Peterson was? Okay, maybe still is, maybe will be again. I don't know. It seems in many ways the Jordan Peterson moment has receded a bit. And I think this concept of the meaning crisis is sort of a better flag, and so we'll keep working on that. And so just recently, John Vervaeke and Chris, I don't remember Chris's last name, and it's a long name, and it wasn't put in the notes in the video, so forgive me, Chris. But Chris, if you're listening, I'd love to talk to you sometime, because he had a ton of good stuff in this conversation. But this video about the symptoms of the meaning crisis, John had told me about it when I had my conversation with him, that this was coming out soon. I've listened to this video 4 or 5 times, and I feel like I can listen to it another 10 times, because there's just so much good stuff in it in terms of looking at why are we seeing the things in the world we're seeing. And of course, Jonathan Peugeot very much has the similar effect on me. As I watch his videos, it's like, oh, okay, now I'm starting to be able to find connections and associations, and we're beginning to see patterns and what's going on. So I want to play some pieces of this video, and this very much began to, now some of the stuff that I was doing earlier in 2019, now it's starting to fit together as I listen to these two guys sort of fit these things together. Now Jonathan, or not Jonathan, his name isn't Jonathan, his name is John. Now John Vervaeke keeps dropping names because he reads all these books, and I know sometimes when I mention a book and I don't put it in the notes section, I hear it in the comment section. Well, same thing. He mentions these books. It's like, I should check out that book. But so what they do in this video is they have sort of a spectrum of reaction to response to reflective response to the meaning crisis. And they really nicely lay it out. Now, again, unfortunately, there was a problem with Chris's mic, so we sort of have to hear him through John's mic, so the sound isn't always great. But, I used to worry more about this stuff, but I don't worry too much about it, because the truth is there'll be another video. There'll be, as I talk about this stuff, I learn, and the vision gets sharper and new things get added, and so they'll probably will. It seems to me like we'll continue to learn through this thing. So, yeah, there's issues with the sound and nothing is perfect, but don't fret. There's good stuff to be learned here.
Recent work by a psychologist who's doing some of the best psychological work on issues of meaning crisis. This is the work of Tatiana Schnell.
Schnell? Someone Schnell.
And she has shown recent research showing that, contrary to what you might think, right, that what happens in suicide is that it's because people are suffering clinical depression that they find things meaningless, and therefore that is why they commit suicide.
Now, one of the things, if you would go back through my years of preaching, suicide, even though the years I've been in this church, we've never had a single suicide, and suicide has often been a recurrent theme in a lot of my sermons, and I've done a fair amount of reading on suicide, partly because I would hear suicide coming from young people, and then I began to notice that, I often noted that in my years in the Dominican Republic working with Haitians who have very difficult lives, I never once heard of a suicide. And you would think that the assumption in America is that, well, if you have money and opportunity and choice, well, then you're happy. And if you have basically the life of a Haitian in the Dominican Republic or in Haiti, well, then you might as well kill yourself because life is horrible. People don't work that way. And I began to notice that, for a while, one place with very high suicide rates were high schools in Silicon Valley. And it's like, now, wait a minute. These are the kids of the titans of industry. These kids should be the happiest in the world if the American assumptions about happiness are true. But here, those kids are killing themselves. And it's like, what's with us? What's with suicide? So I played around a lot with those ideas in a number of sermons back in the day. And so here we are talking about suicide and the meaning crisis.
Now, it's important to understand how much meaning in life is a protective against suicide.
That's huge. How much meaning in life is a protective against suicide? And actually, when I think back on it, a lot of those Haitians, they had tremendous meaning in life. They lived in a world which was full of God and spirits, and it was a very living world. They had tremendous suffering, but they had all that meaning gave them huge buffers against suicide, even though their lives were short and difficult and hard often. And so often when work teams would come down and help build churches and things like that in the Dominican Republic, North Americans would come down and they'd say, oh, they seem so happy. And it'd be like, well, they got problems too, and they're not always happy, and they're putting out, they're showing hospitality when you come, and they're welcoming you, and they're not going to sit down and talk about all their gripes, but, they'll talk about more of their gripes to me than they will to you. But why are we so surprised that, they are happy and that they can enjoy all the same things in life that so many of us enjoy? Probably if you'd send Haitians to North America to observe us, they'd be like, why are you all so anxious? Why are you all so depressed?
And the fact that, right, although globally suicide is going down, it's going up in North America, it's going up for young people worldwide. Child suicide in the United States just recently doubled in the last 5 years.
And child suicide, when I hear that, I just can't imagine. And here's another funny thing. As many of you know, I do a lot of work with homeless people because there's just so many of them here in the area, and I bump into them, and I'm always dealing with homeless people. And I've had some very close relationships with a number of homeless people who were bipolar, who sometimes would be severely depressed. And again, you would think, oh, they should just kill themselves. And I'm sure there are homeless people who do kill themselves. But when I'm thinking about one in particular who was tremendously depressed, and in fact, his grandfather had thrown himself off a bridge in the Bay Area, he told me once. I don't know if it's true or not. But I sometimes wonder, well, why don't homeless people kill themselves more often? I think it has to do similarly with the dynamics with the Haitians. I sometimes wonder if homelessness isn't a psychological strategy to avoid suicide. Because if you're homeless, you actually have to struggle to eat, and you're anxious about where you'll sleep, and you're constantly just trying to survive out on the streets, and the streets are a jungle. But you're not going to kill yourself because your life is full of meaning. And if you read Chris Arnade's book, Dignity, which is a fascinating book, and Esther's been wanting me to talk to him, and maybe I'll reach out to him and see if he's interested. But if you read Chris Arnade's book, one of the things he discovers, as I mentioned in the video I just posted today, which will be yesterday to when I post this video, the poor people in America are very religious. I've never met a homeless person who's an atheist. Well, they've got very interesting theological ideas often, but none of them are atheists. And so I sometimes wonder if homelessness might not be a suicide avoidance strategy, because the struggle of living on the street, the physical struggle, okay, the kinds of struggles that you have if the refrigerator is full and there's money in the bank account and you have health insurance and things are paid for, those tend to be the struggles that lead to suicide, but not the homeless struggles and not the Haitian struggles. And so what is it with this meaning? And meaning is a powerful buffer against suicide. The world is not like we think it is.
All this is very telling. But what's important is that's actually mixing two things up. She has evidence that the experience of meaningless in and of itself, without it overlapping or causing what we now identify as clinical depression, right? The experience of meaninglessness in and of itself can be a cause of suicide. Now, of course, depression.
They're coined the term deaths of despair.
Yeah.
Right? In the
Yes.
United States,
Yes.
Trying to pick up on that.
Trying to pick up on
very
that.
Telling, right?
Now, depression carries within it a sense of meaninglessness. But what's interesting is, and of course there's other things that probably contribute towards a suicide from depression, and I don't want to claim that it's just the meaninglessness, but what there is clear evidence of the meaninglessness per se being able to cause suicide, and therefore that's an important piece of evidence for the emergence, the increasing presence, or lack of presence, of the meaning crisis.
And again, I think that's such a critical point. So often when I would read about suicides in the paper, because again, I was preaching on this, and so I'd be paying attention to suicides, and I'd be finding, this Wall Street banker kills himself, and there's a piece in the New York Times about him where, everyone's surprised. He had everything to live for, and he didn't seem depressed. I have a very good friend whose son took his own life, and it was so strange because if you had asked people in his high school, was he suicidal, they'd say no, he was the happiest kid in school. Well, why did he kill himself? Well, what's going on? And so it's not just suicide. It goes from, in this video, I'm really debating how much of this video I'll play, because I want to play the whole thing, but that's, you can watch the whole thing. You don't have to listen to me yak about it. And by all means, if you haven't seen it, and if you've only seen it once, watch it again. Second discussion, a workshop on symptoms of the meaning crisis. It's a terrific video.
Yes. Yeah. It's a vacuous presence.
Yes.
So there's a bit of a paradox.
Yeah.
Exactly. Okay.
Well, maybe I'll jump to the next section, because I had two pieces that I wanted to play from it.
So the idea here is that what's happening because of the undermining of the agent-arena relationship, we can see addiction increasing.
Now, with a lot of John's videos, like agent-arena relationship, and he's got a ton of terminology that he brings out in his course, which you sort of have to learn, because it isn't necessarily how normal folks talk. It's academic stuff, and it's cognitive science. But they're talking about the loss of religion and the receding of religion, and not just. And when I say religion, I don't simply mean Christianity or Islam or Buddhism or what have you, but a religious posture. Okay, and one of the things that I've noted too, just watching life, is that I watch people come here from other countries, Mexico, Central America, Africa, Asia, and they're coming from places that are far less secular than we have, and they come to America, and part of it's a sample size because immigrants are fairly strongly motivated, but they come here, and in certain ways they're better put together, and you see that all the time. You know, there's something, I don't want to use the word toxic because that word is getting threadbare, but there's something poisonous about our culture that is really hurting people. And when immigrants come, they make better workers, and they have better families, and they, not always, of course, these are generalizations, but what it shows, I think, is the difference between this highly secularized, successful culture, which is sought after. People are coming here voluntarily because of the opportunities, but then, you know, immigrants come, and it's like, you know, they say, well, don't become like those Americans. Well, what do you mean? Well, those Americans who are, their lives are dissipating. Well, why? And I think this has a lot to do with the meaning crisis.
Both because it overlaps with the attempt to escape, which we'll talk about momentarily. But what we have here, and here's where I'm putting, again, Mark Lewis's idea of addiction as basically right, anagoge, right? And this is the idea of addiction as reciprocal narrowing.
Again, anti-anagoge, reciprocal narrowing. Again, watch his course for articulations of this, but, well, he'll explain it actually a little bit now.
So the older model is the disease model. The chemical is inside of me. It's like a disease, and the chemical inside of me is compelling the behavior. Now, obviously, there is a biochemical aspect to addiction, but that model of addiction doesn't cover most, and I've talked.
And it strikes me that there's a parallel here that, yes, clinical depression, which definitely has biochemical and genetic aspect to it, is a contributor to suicide, but also this sense of meaninglessness. In other words, it's not just a single, it's a multivariable question. And what we tend to do, as long as it's multivariable, first of all, just naturally because of hierarchies and consciousness and time and how we function, we always look for one or the principle, and one in isolation, because if there's one, maybe we can deal with the one. And so, okay, so you're depressed, well, let's give you a pill. But there's multiple. Well, that frustrates us because now suddenly we have multiple targets. But the same thing here with addiction, which again, I've as a pastor, addiction is something that you have to deal with. And again, with homeless people, I'm dealing with lots of addictive people. And it might even be that addiction itself is sort of a sickened coping strategy to prevent suicide. Because the chase of the drug or the hit or the high or whatever, that there's meaning in that. And so addiction might also be a sense of it, but you have this reciprocal narrowing, and I love the way Vervaeke connected that with some ideas of suffering in Buddhism in that particular video. And you can go back and watch that in his series, because it's this narrowing of a person's life, and I thought that is so true. And again, it doesn't mean that there aren't other components to addiction, but the thing is, it's these broad, let's call them atmospheric contributions to depression and addiction that I see when I look at differences of experience that I've had overseas in the United States, and differences of experiences that I see in terms of immigrants and those who have been living in America longer. And again, I live in a poor community, and so this particular community here in Sacramento was in Time magazine in 2003, wrote up a piece about this community where, this is the most integrated city in America. There's just, everyone's an immigrant around here, but they're fairly well integrated, and they're not ghettoized as they were more in New Jersey and New York where I grew up. And so I get the chance to see a lot of immigrants. And, when I was we had a Tongan church that was renting from us for a while. They're not renting because they never paid their rent. But they were wonderful people. I really loved them. And it was interesting talking to him about he was an immigrant to the United States. He'd always take his kids back to Tonga to experience some of that life. And he would talk about how growing up here has changed his kids compared to who he was. And, you know, you could just listen to, you should watch wheels turning, thinking about those transformations and listening to him wrestle with it. And so you begin to say it's these atmospheric contributions that are, well, they're perennial. And so they're not perennial, but they're around us. And so they're contributing on they're contributing to many, many things in our lives.
Talked about this just to remind everybody. The idea of addiction of reciprocal narrowing is that it is this degradation and perversion of the agent-arena relationship, right? My agency gets truncated in some fashion. The kinds of identities I can assume, right? The way I can restructure myself in order to change is being diminished. And then that reduces options in the world. And then as the world's options decrease, right, I lose more of my cognitive and my existential identity. I lose options into who and what I can be. The world loses options, and eventually it comes that there is, I can't be other than I am, and there's no opportunities for difference or change. My world becomes locked down, I become locked down, and we get this whole...
And I deal with this all the time with addicts, where, you know, I mentioned this before, one guy who was homeless and, you know, sits, and then they come into my office just to talk to me because I'm willing to listen to them. And then he sits down here in this same chair I'm sitting in, and he puts a can of beer on the table, and he says, my life is in that can. A human being, which is this amazingly powerful creature, and his whole life is about getting beer or getting a hit or getting that high somehow. And it's, yeah, that's addiction.
Addiction spiral, which is basically the opposite of anagoge. So as we lose the agent-arena relationship, that meta-meaning affordance in the meaning crisis, we would expect this kind of thing to become more prevalent. And of course,
and again, if you go back to the observations I was making in February, March of this year, because I was going to Australia and I had to reflect on, okay, I got to pull some things together for that conference, and that's when I began to notice how many of the people am I talking to have been depressed. How many of them have struggled with addiction? And now many of them have kind of flirted with it, and they'll talk about, well, there was about, they'll say, well, there was a few months or even years of my life where I just smoked pot and I played video games, and then, at one point I said, what am I doing? I'm wasting my life. And then boom, cleaned their room, listen to Jordan Peterson, something happened, and they get off that track. But we're always susceptible to this. And a little bit of what later they're going to talk about they talk about video games in this video too, and it's terrific stuff.
It is going to overlap, and wait, let's be very clear. There are also clearly political and socioeconomic drivers to addiction, just like we're talking about a lot of different things here. But let's go back to suicide. What Durkheim showed in his famous book, literally, what is it, like 150 years ago or something now, right? Yeah. A suicide is, in addition to, and he was never denying, his book was called Suicide because what he showed, with really conclusive evidence, and nobody's really undermined it, right, is that in addition to whatever mental health issues people have, their own particular socioeconomic issues, there is a cause of suicide that has to do just with the undermining of, right, the orders, the nomological, normative, and narrative orders. He called that anomie.
The undermining of the orders and undermining of this much richer, broader, bigger world that we live in.
Anomie is directly related, right? Anomie is directly related, Latin, to the normative, especially the nomological order. This is the loss of order, totally order.
And again, I don't have the book here. When I was in 2 videos ago, when I was talking about C.S. Lewis and the discarded image, the whole book is about the loss of the medieval model. And Lewis writes in that book about how, again, when we talk about, well, they're living a grim medieval life, it's almost synonymous with suffering. But Lewis notes that they also were dripping with meaning. And so you have this relationship between suffering and meaning, and suffering, meaning. And if you have suffering but you don't have meaning, and again, look at the work of Viktor Frankl. I mean, he noted this in the Nazi prison camps. And if you've never read Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl's book, definitely read it. It's a masterpiece. It's a great book to read, and I'd read that book years ago. Tim Keller talked about it often in his sermons, and that's why I read it. And so you've got suffering, and if you only have suffering and you don't have meaning, you will not survive. And people are always like, well, what's the adaptive advantage of religion? Well, it's right there. Because you need to live in a rich world in order to endure suffering. And now here in North America, we don't have anywhere near the level of creature suffering. But we also don't have the meaning. And what that means is, Peter Kreeft in his talk that he gave at Socrates in the City a number of years ago, if you Google Peter Kreeft, or Kreeft, I guess that's the better Dutch way to say it, my American throat, Peter Kreeft, The Dark Side, you can find copies of that. Peter Kreeft had it up on his website for a while. I've played it, parts of it in some of my videos. I've linked to it before. But he says, we've made a choice here, where we've reduced through technology and anesthesia, we've reduced the physical sufferings, but now through all of these other ways, we've exploded the psychological and the relational sufferings, and at the same time, we've totally taken away all of the other machinery that was a buffer that gave us meaning, and, well, of course suicide's going to go up. It just makes sense. But because it's sort of an atmospheric condition, we haven't noticed it. And so we just watch things happening and we can't draw the connections.
And so all along the way, we're not claiming that the meaning crisis in any of these is the sole cause. What we're saying is the meaning crisis is going to contribute in important ways all along to the increase in all of these things that we are finding right now. And so the argument here is you're going to see addiction rising, things like the opioid crisis, other forms of addiction rising, precisely because we are in a situation of anti-anagoge, because worldview attunement is being significantly undermined. Okay, so let's erase and right.
Okay, then they're going to go for more. And again, watch that video. If you haven't watched it, and if you've only watched it once, and you didn't see the significance of it, watch it again. Because I thought, for me, that video was a revelation. And, the zombie video was good too, and I learned a bunch of stuff in that. But this video of the symptoms of the meaning crisis really, for me as a pastor, was like, now I can begin to find these connections together. And as I said before, and then once I begin to understand the nature of this crisis, as in many things, once there's a word for it, once there's a flag, once there's a label, well, then suddenly, and there can be some biases in this playing tricks on my mind, but then suddenly I begin to look at the work of Tolkien and Lewis and Barfield in a whole new light. And then, I hadn't known much about Barfield at all, and this crazy new life I'm living where I start with Jordan Peterson. He's a gateway drug. And via Jordan Peterson, I find Jonathan Peugeot. And I don't really understand him very much at first. Like, where's this guy coming from? And everybody's like, you got to talk to Jonathan Peugeot. And it's like, well, I'm not sure what we'll talk about. Maybe we'll fight about Reformed versus Orthodoxy. And we'll have a little steel cage match, me and Jonathan. I'm a lot bigger than he is, but he's a lot younger than I am. So who knows? But Jonathan's such a sweet guy, and we hit it off, and it's great. And the more I listen to his stuff, it's like, oh, wow. I'm learning stuff. And then Struan, who's watching my stuff, well, you got to listen to this Vervaeke guy. And it's like, everybody's sending me stuff to listen to. And now suddenly it's like, oh, wow, Vervaeke's really onto something. There's stuff going on here. And it's all starting to fit together. And now then I understand why J.R.R. Tolkien wrote what he wrote in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings especially, and why whenever they do these competitions about, the most important books of the 20th century, Tolkien, and a lot of a lot of literature people were really ticked off at that. What do you mean Tolkien would win that prize? Tolkien is addressing the meaning crisis through literature. You won't hear him address it directly, but he's actually giving people stuff to endure. And even Tim Keller. So Tim Keller at one point was having some thyroid surgery. So I got a little bit of criticism for talking about personal things in other people's lives sometimes in this video. This is in Tim Keller's sermons, okay? It's out there. You can find it. And the reason I know it is because there was, from 2006 to 2011, I listened to just about everything Tim Keller had done. So that's why I know Tim Keller so well. But Tim Keller, so here you've got this celebrity reformed minister with this crazy successful church. He plants a church in Manhattan of all places that grows to 5,000 people. Why? After 9/11. So you have this rise of the celebrity atheists after 9/11. You also have the rise of Tim Keller. And you say, well, isn't that interesting? And Manhattan, one of the most secular places. Look at my conversations with Luke Zylstra. I guess I've only got one of them posted here, but that was a great conversation that Luke and I had done. And so Luke lives in Manhattan, and he's been to Redeemer and some of the other churches. But why would the celebrity atheists and a conservative reformed church both start to grow after 9/11 in New York City? And why did Tim Keller, Tim Keller able to sort of strike a nerve? So this Tim Keller, this celebrity pastor, he's going in for surgery on a thyroid, and I don't care who you are, I don't care how religious you are. There's something really eerie about them putting the mask on you and saying, we're going to put you out, we're going to cut you open, we're going to play inside your body. Yeah, that'll unnerve you. So, okay, do I really trust these doctors? What choice do I have? So he's going in for surgery. He's going in for thyroid surgery. And our minds, what mysterious things our minds are. What does his mind fix on? This passage in The Lord of the Ring, I've used it in sermons because, of course, pastors are thieves. I steal from Tim Keller. I steal from Jordan Peterson. I steal from John Vervaeke. I steal from Jonathan Peugeot. If I watch your videos, I'll steal from you. He's going into surgery. What is he thinking about? This passage towards the end of Lord of the Rings, when things are really dark. And Frodo, the ring is just taking Frodo. And the fellowship has long broken up, and they're struggling through Mordor. And of course, Gandalf and Aragorn, and they're all doing their things out in the world, but of course Frodo and Sam don't know anything that's going on out in the world. They don't know about Helm's Deep. They don't know about Sauron and the defeat of Sauron. They don't know any of that stuff. They're just trudging through Mordor trying to get to the cracks in Mount Doom, and Frodo's being taken by this ring, and Frodo won't let Sam carry the ring, so Sam is practically carrying Frodo, and Sam, who's really the hero of Lord of the Rings, Sam is ready to give up hope, and he looks up in the sky, and this cloud that had covered Mordor, so there would be darkness for the orc armies to go out. The clouds break, and he sees a star, and the beauty smote him, Tolkien writes. Tim Keller thinks of that when he's on the hospital bed and they're about to wheel him into the operating room to do surgery on his thyroid thing. Well, shouldn't you be reciting a psalm? No, it's Tolkien. And if you can find videos or actually audio recordings of Tim Keller talking about Tolkien. Keller is a huge Tolkien fan. And he said, basically, I read Tolkien, almost devotionally. He's always reading Lord of the Rings. Well, what's happening? Well, Tolkien's dealing with the meaning crisis through his art. And Tolkien brings C.S. Lewis to faith. And Lewis and Barfield, again, as I'm reading The Discarded Image and essays by Barfield, it's like, oh yeah, these guys are talking to each other. These guys are dealing with all the same questions. They're dealing with what John Vervaeke is dealing with. It's all the same issue that we're dealing with. And it's the issue of the discarded image, as Lewis calls it. Well, what a crazy title for a book. And nobody reads that book of Lewis's, but you should. This discarded image, where this model of the universe that the medievals inhabited, that They had so much suffering. They had to endure the Black Death. They had to endure the death of their children. They had to just endure and endure and endure. Well, how do you endure? Well, those who don't endure die and they don't pass on their genes. Little nod to Darwinianism there. Those who do endure, well, what do they have? They have meaning. That's all they have to stand against it. Well, where can we find meaning? Well, where did they get meaning? They got meaning from their worldview, from all of this stuff that you say, well, why was John Vervaeke's stuff been so helpful to me? Because he kind of breaks it down, and I begin to notice all kinds of stuff in my own religion and in religious practice and being a pastor and all of this stuff by saying, oh, that's what we're doing. Oh, that's what we're doing. I didn't have a name for it. Oh, that's the shamanic practice. The Bible's kind of like that, and that's sort of what's happening. And so then I'm reading this stuff. It's like, oh my goodness, this stuff is all over the place. Why didn't I ever see it? It's a meaning crisis. That's where we're deep in. And in fact, this has been going on for centuries. And I want to at some point talk a lot more about Luther and Erasmus. And I should probably send Ron Dart another note and say, okay, I'm ready to talk more about Erasmus because I know more about him. But all of this stuff has been going on a long time, and it's in the water, it's in the atmosphere, and it's impacting us. Well, how to address the meaning crisis? Well, and this is where my conversations between myself and Jonathan Pageau and John Vervaeke, this is where it gets interesting, because, well, now we're talking about practice, and here. And this is what many of the people that are watching my videos, many of you listening to me, and many of the people who write to me, and many of the people I'm having conversations with, they're like, I sort of want to believe, but I can't just believe. And that's right, because our volition is not subject to our will for good reasons. Because if it were, we'd be dead, because we'd believe all kinds of stupid things and we'd die. And again, I've told this story before. When I was a kid, of course, I'm raised in a deeply religious household, in a conservative subculture, but a conservative subculture in the middle of the New York metropolitan area, surrounded by black folks. I mean, what a weird way to grow up, but that's how I grew up. And I'd always wonder, why do people deconvert? Because, of course, the greatest thing is to be Christian reformed. Everything else is second best. So why would people deconvert? And why would people, of course, when you're a kid, and you're just living within the midst of it, you don't know anything. Why would people stumble? Why would people give up on God? Why would people leave the church? Why didn't God just fix it in us in a certain way? Now, those are hard questions, but I know much more now, because you have this model that you run around with, and it bumps into things, and it no longer works, and you're influenced by other models, and your beliefs are, you absorb your beliefs, and your practices are manifest in your beliefs, and there's a lot going on here. And so they're going to talk a little. I should probably just play the video, but there's a lot going on here. So even if you're not Christian, or you're an atheist, or you're a Buddhist, or you describe yourself in some other way, we're all dealing with similar things.
Monastery, like one of the great gifts of the series, in fact, is I'm meeting all these people. I get to meet all these people who are trying to create, basically a new culture, a new set of psychotechnologies, ecologies of practices, community.
And again, we're going to have to, we need a glossary for, John, you should do a video which is just a glossary, just for, maybe your whole series is that. That's probably, you can't do better than that. But you have all these terminologies.
Right, that will allow them to renew the machinery of participatory perspectival knowing, bring about gnosis, try and get anagoge going again. And so seeing more and more of that happening right now.
Right. And what's interesting is I think what a lot of these are trying to do is to rescind a lot of the creedal arrogation that's been characteristic of other.
Now, that right there is, I work in a confessional context. The creedal arrogation that okay, so the question I had when I was a little kid, well, why do people deconvert? Why do they change their beliefs? Why do they change their language? And then as I grow older, I do watch people both convert and deconvert. And so one day they say, well, I'm a Christian. And the day before they said, I didn't believe in God. And you look at them and you say, all right, their language has changed, but they're kind of the same. And then now we're getting into Jordan Peterson's, well, I act as if I believe. And I've made plenty of videos about that. But okay, so we have this language and these identities and these institutions, and a little bit later I'm going to talk today with Sam, who's the guy who grew up in a non-Trinitarian. He grew up in a non-Trinitarian, basically conservative evangelical church, and right there you have all of these issues of well, how does that work? And so then what is the relationship between these beliefs that I subscribe to, the Heidelberg Catechism, the Belgic Confession, the Canons of Dort, the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, the Athanasian Creed? How do all those beliefs then line up with, well, this is where things get very interesting, because the more I listen to Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, we've all got some inklings, and C.S. Lewis wrote about this very well, we've all got some inklings of the life we've always wanted. But none of us are very good at being able to just kind of lay that out and say, well, what is the shorter Westminster Confession? What is the chief end of man? What is the chief end of humanity? Chief telos, chief goal? The answer in the shorter catechism is love God and enjoy Him forever. So a lot packed in there. Well, what do you mean by that? And in many ways, that's exactly where we know, not being an alcoholic is better than being an alcoholic. Not having terminal cancer is better than having terminal cancer. Not having chronic pain is better than chronic pain. But the more you push these things, you begin to realize just how complex this world is. And so we're in a sense all striving for a telos. And even the Bible, if you read the Bible, the images and the stories and the language that it gives us, it's all evocative. And it's descriptive, but the descriptions are, of course, always lodged within a symbolic world. And of course, that's what Jonathan has really been focusing on, and connecting that symbolic world of the Bible and helping us to see both the world of the Bible and the far broader world within a symbolic grammar. All right? But it's this telos that is just sort of whispered to us, and we can't describe it. And we can recognize, well, this is better than that, and this is better than that, and that's a life lived better than this life. But, well, then you get higher resolution, and you say, well, yeah, but in this other way, not so much, and it's terribly complicated. And so how does any of that have to deal with these language systems that we inherit? Now, part of the problem is obviously, well, the people die, and the language endures. And so part of it is just books. So we have books that remain, and 50, 100 years from now, Jordan Peterson will be gone, and how much he'll be remembered is yet to be seen, but his book will remain. And so part of the reason that churches are so hung up on language and precision and words and formulations is because we need something to navigate by, and words and books are often sort of the best we have, but they're also often insufficient.
There's generally a move into the body, there's a move into flowing discourse.
And so now with the meaning crisis and with all the rapid changes that we've had, and with institutions losing their effectiveness and people bailing out of them and corruption in institution, everyone is looking for, well, now this gets into the matter-mind dichotomy that I spoke about in my last video. It has to do, I think, with the broad sweeps that Barfield is trying to play with. But it's, we differentiated ourselves in the axial age And so by creating this imaginary monarchical vision by which we suppose we see the world objectively, we divorced ourselves from the world. Again, Thomas Nagel deals with some of this stuff. Well, now we got to put it back together. So of course, I mean, what's hot in the religious space? When I went to Australia, Warren, so I shouldn't badmouth Warren. I love Warren's a great guy. He wrote this book, and I do want to do some talking with Warren about it. But Warren's got to finish his vacations, and he and I got to sit down and do some of this stuff. But so Warren's been going to this, and Warren's been all over the map in terms of religious. He grew up in a dispensational church, and then he went to a charismatic church, and now he's going to a traditional Anglican church where, you know, it's formal liturgy and it's very body, okay? And tiny little old church. And in Australia is sort of, you know, taken over by Hillsong and Expressive, Pentecostal. See, Pentecostalism is also another movement towards the body, and that begins at the 20th century. But this whole movement now towards the Orthodox and the Roman Catholic and traditional Anglicans and liturgy and weekly Lord's Supper. When I got to Sacramento, the seeker movement was the heyday of churches, and it's big sounds and big boxes, and it's very disconnected from body. And within the last 20 years, it's been interesting to watch the church plant sort of flip. You know, they all do weekly communion. And you know, you walk in and here's this bowl of water and you remember your baptism. These are Christian Reformed churches. This stuff wasn't in Christian Reformdom in the beginning of the 20th century at all, but it all has to once again inhabit the body, because somewhere in this, some of our consciousness Congress senses, we have to reunite the mind and the matter, and we have to start there and work our way out again. And so that's why you go to a place like Midtown in Sacramento is where. So my son moved out of the house and moved into Midtown, so he has his own apartment there. So along with all the other 20-somethings, it's sort of like college without classes, where they got jobs and, you know, yoga studios on every corner. Well, why yoga? Well, yoga is all about the body and getting back in touch with the body. Read Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, working with people who have post-traumatic disorders. And so then they do yoga, and it's all about getting into the body. And sometimes I talk to people who have you know had terrible childhoods or sexual abuse, and they talk about this disassociation from the body. And me, I've never had any of those things, and I'm like, what are you talking about? I mean, I've never been disassociated with my body. But where's all this stuff coming? You got to get back to the body.
Yeah.
To the level of meaning system arbitrarily, right? They're not basically superimposing.
They're not inflating some system into a meta-meaning.
Inflating something to be endlessly meaningful, or to use your terminology, to be endlessly or ultimately relevant unto it.
And what they're talking about is the inflation of things to, you know, they basically become fads. They become these quasi-religious fads, and even the stuff that Jordan Peterson is, you know, Nazism and communism, and they'll talk about that here in a minute too. I mean, these new replacements of religion, and that's what happened in the middle of the 20th century, and, you know, horrible. I mean, people talk about, oh, the Inquisition. What, a few hundred people got killed in the Inquisition? Yeah, the horrors of what we did in the 20th century.
So,
Right.
Which is, again, to borrow Tillich's term, is that idolatrous instinct to try and take.
Yeah, there's a deep resistance to idolatry in the Renewing Gnosis project.
That's right. And that's why a lot of those praxes and practices are.
And again, 30 years ago, praxis was a hot word in theology. And you know, again, it's all trying to get back into, reconnect the mind and matter.
And there's sort of another, somewhere here, which we've kind of glanced over for the purposes of time, is this idea of serious play, right?
Right, the serious play.
Opening up a space in which to re-engage a state of play that is characteristic of the phenomenology.
And that's in a lot of these,
And you look at you look at the high adrenaline sports, and on one hand you say, well, people are bored. Well, that's another, again, a reconnection with the body to, if homelessness is potentially a buffer against suicide, well, so is jumping out of an airplane with a parachute, or highlining, or a number of, or yoga, or all of these things. Again, we're okay. We need meaning. Well, we got to start somewhere. Well, let's go back to the most basic thing. Part of it is also obviously materialism. That philosophically, well, it all starts in matter. So that's part of this too, I suspect.
And it's in a lot of these, right?
Yeah.
Because one of the ways of understanding the creedal ossification of religious praxis is understanding how the credo, the set of constraints that were meant to condition the state of play, right? A mnemonic device that provokes you into a state of connectedness, end up becoming the end to the practice, right?
Right, because the books and the words and the creeds outlive the people. And
that's right.
Instead of conditioning the arena for play, they end up actually enclosing on it. And so what I think this is trying to do is open up the arena again,
Right.
by
And open up the agency too.
By slackening the grip that that these creeds have.
Yes, but open up both of them.
And that anti-creedal movement. I mean, this is, again, this is a long movement. But if you look at church history, no creed but Christ. Some of you grew up in churches that, no creed but Christ, or it's just the Bible. And, we got to get away from these creeds. And evangelicalism, which was, kind of, well, where God number one is dead, so everything is God number two. So God number two expands to fill the vacuum left by the death of God number one. And it's, well, it doesn't matter, your church, that church. What's so funny is that what evangelicals were saying 30 years ago, well, the creeds and that stuff doesn't matter. It's just being close to Jesus. If you go and I listened to Marianne Williamson running for president on Bill Maher, and so she's promoting the Book of Miracles, which is a book that but again, same thing, and they'll tell you, well, yoga or Buddhism or the Book of Miracles, it's not about religion or anything else. And it's like, not so fast. It's way more complicated than that. And but that again is the movement. We've got to get away from all these creeds that have restricted us, and we have to somehow get back to something and rebuild again. And then, of course, you've got people who get onto that process, and then, someone like Nathan Jacobs, who, where does he find himself? Within the creeds.
Right. I think these are only accumulating more and more and more, these kinds of reflective responses.
I think we've got serious play there, and that's overlapping with renewing gnosis. So I also see that there are people who are doing serious play and renewing gnosis with the framework that's been sort of tattered to, like Christianity. And I'm thinking of people, we've mentioned him multiple times, Jonathan Pajot. I think of the really interesting work that Paul Vanderklay is doing, in which there's an attempt. I give them a lot more credit than I think they do. I think they're attempting to bring these elements,
I didn't know. Actually, serious play is a very good word for what I do with these videos. Although that's not the definition he's using.
Or claim that these elements can be found, rehomed within Christianity, and revive Christianity as an attempt to do that.
And part of this, and this is where Jonathan Pajot and myself and John Vervaeke kind of make an interesting trio, in that, I'm coming from a Protestant tradition, and I know some people are griping, right? Too much Orthodox stuff, and it's like, no, Protestants are protesting things in a tradition that say, well, let's improve that. But I don't want my channel to be Christian intramural fighting. To me, that does a disservice to Jesus' desire expressed in the Gospel of John, that all of his followers would be one. So I'm very sensitive about that. I've got my own beliefs, so on and so forth. But so yeah, and so for me, part of it is, if you say, boy, I need an operating system for something, you know what everyone starts with? Linux. You take it off the shelf, because to rebuild the sucker, good luck.
Like symbolic rehabilitation.
Yes, in a very serious way.
Symbolic rehabilitation. That's a fascinating idea.
A symbol, again, like to use the example of the Christian framework, to take a symbol again, and this is only one dimension of the complexity of that symbol, but taking a symbol fundamentally that has been constricted somewhat by the ossification of the creed that surrounds it.
Now my doctrinal governor that keeps me from getting kicked out of the ministry is that. Now, Paul, what did you just say a minute ago? Did you just say that your Christian belief is simply a pragmatic attempt to use Linux instead of building your own operating system? That's an illustration of, I think, part of the challenge that I think John faces with, and he's working on this in his own way. It's the same challenge that Jordan Peterson notes when he says you don't just sit down and write a fairy tale. This is to actually construct a world. I think that's beyond us, and each of us, we live such short little lives, and we make such small contributions that but I don't say any of that to in any way undermine the confession of my faith that I believe that Jesus is Lord and Savior and the Bible is the Word of God and all those things. Because sometimes I know people hear these videos and they're like, "Oh, Vanderclay, yeah, settle down, it's okay."
Praxis that surrounds the connectivity and the conductivity of that symbol that has been inhibited by the sort of the burgeoning fundamentalism and atheism, right? Those twin.
And I like how fundamentalism and atheism are sort of twin things. And I want to do a video on fundamentalism, actually, because the more I learn from John Vervaeke, the better I understand what fundamentalism is, and why, in a sense, we very dramatically and, in a sense, woodenly attempt to reappropriate literally this other thing in an attempt to redo it. And you find this movement in Christianity, in church history again and again and again and again. That, Saint Francis, gonna do what it says in the Bible. And if I do what it says in the Bible, then maybe I will experience some of this Acts 2. Went back when I was preaching through the book of Acts years ago. There are these glory days in the end of Acts chapter 2 and in Acts chapter 4 where you have these moments where it's like, oh, the kingdom is so vivid and real, and I want to get back to that moment. So I need to do what they did. And so St. Francis gives away all his things, and in many ways a success. But it never lasts, and you never can actually simply go back, because it isn't the first century, and there are aspects to the first century that aren't included in the text, and actually, if you read closely the New Testament, you discover, oh gosh, it's a mess. Churches are all over the map doctrinally. I mean, all these doctrinal formulations had not yet been brought up, and so that right there you get to the question of words, words versus life, and you begin to realize this is always a dynamic struggle. So the early church had very little doctrine; they just had practice, and eventually they gain wisdom, and that's what institutions they gather wisdom and they build it up, and they get it to a point that now it's accessible by others, and over the centuries you build it. But as you build institutions, you're also developing corruption, then you're also limiting, and it's always a dynamic practice.
Yeah.
Totally confused responses to the diminishment of the power of that symbol, and to try and take that symbol and certainly not to extricate it from its mythos, because it has to be couched to some degree in a mythos in order to be viable. But it's about figuring the mythos in such a way as to free it from what have become a parasitic sort of creedal impositions.
So we would put things like the mindfulness revolution here, for example, right? Because it's an attempt to right? Especially if they're trying to situate themselves within a community, an ecology of practice, not just meditate so they relax or reduce stress, but if they're pursuing it as a philosophia, as a transformative way of life, then we've got that also going here. I would think we might want
authentic discourse.
Like I said, the authentic discourse.
Yeah.
Like I mentioned, Peter Lindbergh's work,
yeah.
right? And we've got the wisdom renaissance. There's more and more people talking about wisdom, ways of life, and trying to bring about not only in the popular world, where like Stoicism, for example, is becoming something that is becoming more and more adult.
Stoicism is having this incredible revival,
rebirth, right? But
unfortunately, it's mistaken a lot. But it's having a revival.
But I was also going to say and I'll get to talk about this later in the series, the academic, scientific interest in wisdom has now come back. What about the psychedelic renaissance? I think this is also an attempt to renew Gnosis. It's an attempt to use psychedelics.
Yeah,
as long as
the use. It's interesting though, because the use of psychedelics can fall on a few different places in the spectrum.
Fair enough. So what I would argue, and what I've argued, is where psychedelics are being set within, again, a set of psychotechnologies for the function of bringing about a higher state of consciousness and bringing about some fundamental avenue and affordance of self-transcendent, the cultivation of wisdom. Then we're getting that kind of thing here.
That's right. Okay. So yeah, use of psychedelics as situated within a praxis of some kind that trains it and enculturates.
So I think all of this end is very, for me, it's very hopeful. But I want to make a criticism here, and it's meant to be a constructive criticism, not a negative criticism. I see a lot of this, and again, I'm not trying to detract from the value, but I see a lot of this as being very, very bottom up. Right, in that there's a lot of these practices that are emerging, but how they should be coordinated and how they should be integrated, related together, and how that is supposed to ultimately fit back with.
So the integration and the related together, those tend to be institutional moves. That's why institutions develop to coordinate, to relate, to create a sustained effort. And I think John is dead on right here that right now everybody's doing this on their own, and this has been a weakness of Protestantism too. You go over that it's also been it's both a weakness and a feature, because the limited institutionalism of Protestantism. I mean, evangelicalism is not an institution. It's practices, but there's no institution. So it's a very live thing, but it's very much, it's all bottom up. It's all bottom up. And of course, those looking at it from the Orthodox and the Roman Catholic, and even from denominational places within evangelicalism, look at it and say, oh, what a mess. But what John is talking about has very much been the case. And I think now we have a sense of it really, in a way, coming from the non-religious side. And I mean, that could in fact be from the post-Christian side, because these dynamics have been happening within religious traditions for a while now. But maybe what we see now happening as we've gotten sufficiently post-Christian, and enough people within the small arcs of their life have gotten sufficiently post-Christian that they're realizing, and they're sort of automatically doing the kinds of things and looking for the kinds of practices to fill those voids in their life. And, well, now we begin to see, well, institutions. No, now we're going to have to start dealing with the dynamics of institutions. And back to, again, the Os Guinness quote. It might have come from someone before Os Guinness. Without individuals, nothing changes. Without institutions, nothing lasts. And I know some of you out there have really taken that to heart. And some people have noted that, now we have a Discord server, and I've tried to keep my channel not too institutional. It's apart from the Christian Reformed Church. It's even apart from my local congregation. And now we've got Bridges of Meaning, which is starting to begin with our local Jordan Peterson meetup, where Bridges of Meaning might become an organization that will allow different people in different places to facilitate and hold meaningful conversations. And I almost wonder if, whereas before it put Jordan Peterson meetup into meetup.com and I could gather 10 to 20 people, maybe 2-3 years from now, see, meaning doesn't have that much of a flag. It's too general. So we're still working that out. But it's what John is talking about that we're dealing with here right now.
Right, the scientific worldview that is the dominant worldview of the West. So what I mean is we've got the bottom-up processing, but we don't have the top-down.
And this is exactly what C.S. Lewis is dealing with in The Discarded Image. At the top down, at the sacred canopy, John was about to say this, the sacred canopy is gone.
We don't have anything that is yet analogous to what the sacred canopy is. And so what we're still struggling with, right? And when I talk to people about this, right, some of these people, this comes out, which is, I've talked about this hard problem, right? This is still taking place against the backdrop, right, of the socioeconomic crisis, right, the ecological crisis, all these things that are very exigent, right? And so,
and it's an uphill battle, because what it's also doing is it's having to somehow circumnavigate all of this, right? Because especially, I mean, this speciates.
It has to circumnavigate. See, in many ways, what they're talking about here has been the Jordan Peterson movement. And when he's saying that's to circumnavigate this, he's pointing to things on the blackboard. I know a bunch of you are just listening to this. Or on the whiteboard. He's pointing to things on the whiteboard, such as this romanticism that was supposed to replace religion, and then later the children of romanticism, which was, say, Nazism and communism and all of these things that were supposed to replace the sacred canopy, but actually were, as Jordan Peterson calls, what does he call them? They're these crippled religions, and so right now, trying to deal with this stuff, well, lo and behold, we're getting all tangled up in the culture war. Well, of course we are, because the culture war is in many ways a decaying of Christendom. Okay? Many times I've said before that the culture war is a civil war within Christendom, but it's also a decaying of Christendom. It's what happens when you had, again, this process in many ways starts with the Protestant Reformation. Again, I'm not canceling my Protestant card here, all right? Or I'm not canceling my credentials in a confessional church within this whole long conversation. But the Roman Catholic Church came apart. And, well, the United Church came apart. I mean the United Church, the Roman Catholics and the Orthodox together. This is a decaying process, and so very quickly we find ourselves getting tangled up in a bunch of the things going on, and John Vervaeke has been very circumspect about avoiding a bunch of the stuff that Jordan has gotten into. And for some of us who are watching this, watching Jordan focusing on the meaning crisis stuff. Now I have words for it. I didn't have words for it before. The meaning crisis stuff, every time he, trots over into politics, we're like, ooh. And maybe my last video say, oh, Paul, you trotted over into politics. And you almost can't help it. You're going to say some stuff because there is an application phase. But the point is not to get politically partisan in an American context, to be Democrat or Republican. In fact, pastors have been playing this a long time. Tim Keller continues to try and, don't pin me as one political party or another, because politics should be downstream from this stuff. And if you listen to guys like David Brooks and many others, we've made politics too important. And they're about to talk about this because politics has been replacing, and we're trying to use politics to function in something that politics is not able to function. It's a category mistake. I should let them say it. They say it better.
What we call generally neo-Gnostic, but the general responses tend to speciate a lot of independent meaning systems. Tribalism is sort of a part of this,
yes,
right?
Yeah, very much. Very much a having mode, having an identity, right?
Yeah. A lot of different systems that all ascend to the level of meta-meaning, and they're all now in competition with one another. That's where the issue of tribalism comes into play, right? These single modes of identification that want to fashion themselves.
single modes of identification. This is identity politics. Well, I'm black. Well, I'm gay. Well, I'm Dutch. Well, I'm white. Well, I'm Democrat. I'm Republican. And if you know, this is incredible lately. If you're black, but you don't say what a certain group of black people say and white people say you should say, they take away your black card. And it's like, well, wait a minute. My skin may be black, but that's not all I am. That's why I really love the conversations between Glenn Loury and John McWhorter. You have someone who's sort of on the political right and someone who's sort of on the political left, and they're both black men. They're both Ivy League, significant scholars and well respected in their fields, but they're having real conversations because they say, I'm a man before I'm black, and I'm a human being before I'm male. And part of what's this identity stuff is because the sacred canopy is gone, and so we're looking for something to find ourselves in, and we go down and say, well, it's in my oppression as being black. You look at the Ben Boyce, James Lindsay conversation, or you look at my identity as beautiful, and so it's just on and on and on, and it's all insufficient. I tell people often that one individual life is too small of a platform to actually have a life on.
Themselves into prisms through these single modes of identification that want to fashion themselves into prisms through which through which to see and interpret all things.
Right.
And again, if you look at James Lindsay and Ben Boyce's conversation, in order to, using critical theory, in order to have, if you deconstruct your blackness, well, you've deconstructed everything. And so what you do then, if you're a black theorist or a feminist, you take one of these identities and that is preserved from deconstruction, so it can become a prison through which you see everything else. And when I listen to that, I'm reading guys like Cornelius Van Til and late 19th, early 20th century Reformed thinkers who are working through presuppositionalism and all these kinds of things that says, C.S. Lewis says basically, you need something through which to see everything else. And if you pick something that's too small, it's going to distort your whole world and it's going to make your life small. In some ways, it's like this reciprocal narrowing, just like addiction. And you become addicted to your oppression in some tiny aspect, or you become addicted to your power in another aspect. You become addicted to your identity. And this is why we see all of this stuff happening. These are all symptoms of the decay of Christendom and the loss of the sacred canopy. It's all the same problem. And again, so the meaning crisis is actually a large enough, I think perhaps a large enough conceptual label through which maybe we can begin to identify all the various pieces of this.
And so any effort to try and
there's a tension with there's an aspect in which this could be sucked into a lot of the bullshitting that's going on here. So there's that difficulty. There's also the difficulty of trying to do this with and avoid the totalitarian trauma that a lot of these things are associated with, right? But also a lot of these people, the nostalgic attempt to go back to an organized religion is no longer available to them. So
and I think he said it perfectly. The nostalgic attempt to go back to an organized religion is no longer available to them. I want to nuance that a little bit because I've talked to plenty of people for whom it's working pretty well for them now. Now, will it continue to work? And that's been part of my question about the movement back to orthodoxy. And I think what we're going to continue to see is that if this trickle becomes a flood of Americans coming into the Orthodox Church, Americans with evangelical backgrounds and so on and so forth, that will change orthodoxy. Because churches are always these living dynamic things, and churches are on a spectrum in terms of how rigid. And we talked about these doctrinal accretions. These are incredibly complex matrices. All right, I mean, the complexity of this is just mind blowing. And you even see it in one small tiny congregation, but it's especially true in things larger like denominations, and when you get to these very large institutions, for the Roman Catholic Church, an extraordinarily old, extraordinarily large, extraordinarily complex institution. To try and maintain an institution of that size is just mind-blowing. But that's all what's happening here. And so there is, in a sense, no simply going back. And this has been the attempts of, let's say Francis, or the Jehovah's Witnesses movement, or many attempts to just simply go back. Even my own Christian Reformed tradition, if you read a lot of the texts, and I can pull them off the shelf, it's like, well, we have deacons and elders just like the New Testament church. And if you're watching it, it's kind of like, well, the deacons in Acts 6, that's not exactly like the deacons at Living Stones, because they're in two different contexts and they've got two different missions, and so there's no simply going back, but it's also the case that often an attempt to go back brings in new light. And we've seen this again and again in church history, that there's been all these attempts to go back, and what comes forward is sort of a new thing. And even the Protestant Reformation, I mean, that's very much an attempt to go back. Okay, we're going to get rid of the accretions, everything, and we're going to just focus on the Bible as canon, and the church fathers get demoted and the Apocrypha gets demoted. But of course, as what Luther finds out, is that, well, Luther and Karlstadt, they're friends. They're right next to each other, and they're reading it in different ways. And Karlstadt, in some ways, sort of goes off and becomes part of the Radical Reformation. And the Anabaptists will come, and John Calvin, a second generation reformer, will look at all of this chaos and try to synthesize it with French refugees coming out of Geneva, and now they're going to try to apply it in Geneva using the city council, and on and on and on and on and on. We're always working on this stuff. But the issues are right here, and so what I'm seeing now is that, well, now many post-Christians are saying, I can't just walk into church and say, I believe. I don't even know what that means. Jordan Peterson doesn't even know what that means. When I'm saying I don't know what that means, I mean, for what someone coming into church, my friend Job, who I've had multiple conversations with online here, so some of his background. Jem, my conversations with him. This is exactly where people are struggling, and for Christians, this is what I could talk. Jesus talked more strongly to his disciples and to the religious leaders than he talked to the people outside, and so Christians who jump in and just want to say, well, why can't you believe? Well, there are reasons. Give people some space. Give them some patience. Give them some grace. Give them some time. Please, please, let the messiness continue. And if you want to be helpful, get down into the messiness. Don't try to control them. Develop healthy relationships with them. Listen to them. Offer what they ask for. Don't shove it down their throats.
Here's what I'm saying. They are pursuing, and I think sincerely and not ineffectively, but they are pursuing a comprehensive transformation of consciousness, cognition, character, and communitas. But the only thing that has successfully done that for us in the past is religion. Right. They find that the orthodox existing religions are
still very powerful. I mean, You made a reference, Nietzsche's quote about grammar, in our previous video, and it's like we still speak and think in the language.
So there are people trying to break out of that. Like I know Jordan Greenhall is trying to break out of that grammar in some of his work. But what we're saying is trying to not get sucked up into the nostalgia that is almost imprinted on us because of the grammar.
And nostalgia, I used to badmouth nostalgia. I understand the role of nostalgia in individuals' people's lives, but it's dangerous. It's dangerous in times like these. You've got to keep your eye on nostalgia and don't let it get too out of place.
We don't want to go back to the pseudo-religious ideologies that drench the world in blood. And so these nascent, right, I don't know what to call them, these nascent cultures, these nascent communities or whatever, right? They're facing tremendous difficulty in terms of what's the template, what do they pattern themselves on in order to try and create the overarching structure that will organize the bottom-up change.
And again, when I listen to him talk, I think about Chuck Colson and Jimmy Carter in the 1970s and the Born Again movement. I think about Billy Graham and the Crusades in the 1950s and that movement. I think about the Azusa Street Mission in the beginning of the 20th century and that movement. These movements have been happening in church history again and again and again, usually a little bit more within the framework. They've been able to keep some of the framework. And I think what we're seeing now is the post-Christians, the nuns and the duns, and with some voices from around the world, but it's the same process. The same needs are there that have been manifest again and again and again in church history. The Moravians, the Hutterites, to call out to Julian, the Christian Reformed Church, and the Afscheiding and the Doliancy, these Reformed movements in the Netherlands that were trying to go back. These are all parts of the same dynamic, and many moves were tried, and this is all the same process. But now we're seeing it from folks who had given up on Christianity. So in a sense, the canopy's blown wide open, and now they've got the fragments of science and now the increasing study of cognitive science. And so you've got now these new tools by which they're trying to piece it together. Again, watch the whole video. It's all terrific. And it's what C.S. Lewis was dealing with, the long, slow crisis. Loved the medieval model, but it wasn't true, and he couldn't provide the tools we need for other worthwhile projects he pursued, and it hasn't been replaced. And like I said before, if you need an operating system, often you pick up something off the shelf because there's too much there, and your life is too short to write a whole new one yourself. So what's going on? Well, in the March question and answer, Jordan, maybe I won't play it because this has gone on a while anyway. In the March question and answer, well, maybe I will play it.
What question are you asked way too seldom? Oh, well, that's pretty easy. At least if the question is, what question am I asked by journalists way too seldom? And the answer to that would be, Dr. Peterson, what the hell is going on? And what I mean by that is, why are so many people coming to your lectures, let's say, and why did your book strike such a chord? I think the first one is the most important one.
Now he goes on about this for a while, but that's exactly right. What's going on? And I would have to say, you stumbled exactly right into the meaning crisis with, well, look at the title. The title of your book. I was listening to someone talk the other day, and I was thinking about the beginning of his 2017 classroom lectures on maps of meaning, and he's talking about the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and he's talking about inequality. And that's where all this stuff comes from. And Jordan, and I want to do some more videos on this because I think that there are lots of elements to this. But for some reason, all of the different elements of Jordan just kind of lined up with the post-Trump moment, Brexit, all of these things, and just the man and the moment found each other, and whoosh. And I thought a lot about that when I was reading the book on Luther and Erasmus, because Luther, it was exactly the right, the world is so complex. He had exactly the right elector. The printing press was there. He had exactly the right, or wrong, but the right temperament for explosion, as opposed to Erasmus, who was doing other things, and just whoosh. And Europe was set ablaze for hundreds of years. This is how history works. And then when you begin to realize, when you begin to say, listen to begin to understand the symptoms of the meaning crisis and what we're talking about and the picture of it, and then you listen to something that I've listened to a few times, it all makes perfect sense.
It's been impacted by you. Over 3 million books have been sold.
And this at Liberty University continues to blow my mind.
Into the Barnes & Noble the other day, and you know you're doing well when you've got good product placement in a book right in the front, but you know you're doing really well where they have stacks and stacks of your book.
And evangelicals pay attention to economics. They really do. It's a big part of the movement, because when you don't have an overriding institution, like, let's say, Roman Catholics or even a denomination, but it's way too big, what do you look at? You look at money. You look at numbers. It's very scientific. It's part of the scientific culture of the age.
Behind the cash register just to keep up with the demand. And the young lady that was there started talking to me a little bit, and then this other employee came up and he said, it's been interesting. So many men are buying this book. Typically, women are a lot more frequent, shoppers at a bookstore these days. But he said this book is just taking over the world. And so why do you think it has just touched a nerve? Why do you think this book has really triggered?
Now pay attention to the word meaning.
12 Rules of Life, and really connected with so many people.
Well, I think the fundamental reason, I've sort of learned this in the live lectures that I've been doing, because I've visited about 150 cities with my wife over the last year.
And it's interesting, too, because, in some ways, Jordan was doing what he'd always been doing. He wrote this in 99. And this is a question I asked him on my conversation with him, which you can find on my channel. This is what he'd always been doing. And so we all stumble into this thing in many ways.
It's a lot of cities. And I've watched the audiences very carefully and listened to them to see what resonates and what doesn't. And I think the basic argument that I've been laying out is that, well, we all have difficult lives, that life is characterized in large part by suffering. That there's an inevitable element of suffering in life. Obviously that's symbolized in Christianity by the crucifixion, which is a very harsh symbol. And not only is life sorrowful in part, but it's also touched by malevolence, and malevolence of each of us, and the malevolence of our social creations, our societies, and even in some sense the kind of blind malevolence of nature. And so it's a demanding occupation to exist as a human being, and you need something to sustain yourself through that. It's not optional, because the price of existence is so high that without that sustaining meaning, it corrupts you.
You can't live without meaning. You must have meaning. You'll kill yourself without it. Meaning is a powerful preventative to suicide.
It embitters you, and once you're embittered, things go downhill rapidly. You get vengeful, and you get angry, and you get destructive, and there's really no limit to that. And I've been suggesting to people that the sustaining meaning that they can find in their life isn't to be found through happiness, let's say, because happiness doesn't work when you're not happy.
I love happiness doesn't work when you're not happy. But again, go back to earlier in the video, this is exactly my point. This is exactly what I noticed, that Haitians, homeless people, in terms of how Americans think the world works, these people should be offing themselves, they're standing in that little narrow thing here in the middle of Florin Road. They're like, my life sucks. Step in front of a truck. They don't do it. Not much. Daniel, not much, okay? And so that's why I say there's way more going on here. Meaning addresses suffering. Viktor Frankl.
when things have gone badly for you, for even for accidental reasons. But you can find sustaining meaning and responsibility. And you can take responsibility for yourself.
Now, responsibility, see, so I've done a lot of videos on Peterson and meaning, because, again, meaning is Jordan Peterson's sacrament. Now, if because of our current cultural framework, you can't navigate by the stars, again, you need the mythos. But if your mythos is extremely weak, as it is in a secular society, you can't navigate by the stars. You have to do, basically you just have to navigate down here below. And so it's all this little A/B pattern. Well, this feels more meaningful than that, then do that. So clean your room, take a goal, work on that goal. And it's all this dead reckoning down below because you can't see the stars. And so responsibility, well, our lives are dripped with responsibility because everybody's shucking responsibility in our culture, because we've all been told that happiness is found in release from responsibility. That's our definition of freedom. And Jordan comes along and says, take responsibility. And you know what you discover? Well, I don't have as much time, but I'm experiencing meaning. Well, this feels good. Again, we're dead reckoning. We can't, the credos have been decaying, and the structure has been decaying. So I'm feeling meaning, and I'm feeling happiness, and I cleaned my room, and I decided to take on that difficult relationship and have that hard conversation, and it went well. Sometimes it didn't go well. You won't hear those testimonials, but it went well, and my relationship with my father is better. And these are the times that Peterson will break down and cry. I mean,
you can do that. And if you take responsibility for yourself, you treat yourself as if you're someone that's worthy of care and discipline. And that has nothing to do with being soft on yourself or the pursuit of pleasure, any of those things. You can take responsibility for yourself, and that works. And then if you do that,
it works. It's dead reckoning. You don't need to navigate by the stars. It works.
Properly, you can take responsibility for your family. And then if you do that properly, you can take responsibility for your community, and you can continue to burden yourself voluntarily, let's say, with a greater and greater range of existential challenges.
And now a lot of people listening to this have said, well, this is old wisdom. Yeah, where did that old wisdom come from? Well, it came from you grew up and you were embedded within institutions. You were embedded within a family, within a community, within a church. And everyone said, well, if you want to be a man, being a man means taking responsibility. So, here's a pig, raise it. And part of, again, there's a transition from rural to urban. Rural had within it all these responsibilities because there was just way more responsibility. So I can't chase all those animals. Son, you take care of this. And if you don't fix that fence, the whole family's going to go hungry. So, boy, you had meaning right away. Those Haitians have it right away. But we wealthy, affluent, urban, secular people, we're the ones that kill ourselves.
All that does is make more and more and more of you. And that works as an antidote to the catastrophe of life. And so I speak to my audiences seriously and pessimistically in some sense about part of the substructure of existence, the mortal side, the fragile side, but conclude, I would say, that there's more to you than there is to what faces you. And I believe that to be true. And
until there isn't.
And then I'm encouraging people to attempt that. And I think part of the reason that the book has been perhaps particularly popular among men is because I don't think we do a very good job at the moment of encouraging men. We have this idea that there's something intrinsically oppressive about the patriarchy and about masculinity in general. And I think that's nonsense. I think that strong, honest, truthful, courageous men pursuing noble goals is of great benefit to everyone, male and female alike.
Standard stuff for Peterson, right? We've heard it a ton. Well, if you understand it with the backdrop of the meaning crisis, well, you might hear even more. So people can and do willingly endure horrendous suffering in exchange for meaning. Soldiers do it in battle. Women do it in childbirth. Religious people in situations that secular people bail on. Look at divorce rates. Look at who does and doesn't divorce. Say, yeah, religious people divorce. Yeah, but the really religious stay married longer. And, you know, I'm not saying that divorce is never the right option. I'm just saying this is what the world was made of, and we're looking at a continued decay of Christendom. And so then the question is, well, what can we do? And I think part of what we're seeing is that this post-Christian tribe has gotten to the point of saying, or many have gotten to the point of saying, we need to do something. And it's going to involve, and again, it's going to involve mythos, and it's going to involve institutions, and it's going to involve practices. But you can't just build up from the practices willy-nilly, because, well, that's why institutions start. And again, as someone who works in a religious institution, you see it all the time. You say, okay, you got an idea for a ministry, you go start it. And they go start it. And they, you know, if it takes off at all, which is the exception to the rule, if it takes off at all and it starts going really well, the next thing you have to do is come alongside it with kind of a container. Say, okay, this is how we're going to manage it. And if you manage the container well, it grows further. It's sort of like putting the tomato stake next to the tomato plant. Okay, then suddenly you're a gardener. It's achieving what you need to do. And maybe you're going to prune it. I am the vine, you are the branches. The Father prunes all those vines that are productive. But so often, in even church things, I see us BSing around with political pablum. And, you know, something happens, and it's about race, and it's about guns. There's too many guns. There's not enough guns. It's about mental illness, all these shootings. I really appreciated the article in Quillette about the deadly boredom of a meaningless life. Is that perhaps the better framework through which to look at these shootings and a whole lot more things? And, you know, it was very interesting. Jonah Goldberg on This Week brought that up, and I thought, oh, look at that. And just today I saw an Unbelievable, and they had Malcolm Geit and Mark Vernon talking about Tolkien and Lewis and Barfield. I thought, oh, look at that. And then JR posts on Twitter this GIF. It's happening, isn't it? And so, you know, I'm with John Vervaeke and Jonathan Peugeot in that I'm tremendously excited about what I see happening. And Justin Brierley, who's been doing great work for a long time, he's very much in the mix. And as the typical dour Calvinist that I am, I'm going to add some sobriety. These are long processes, and the world is big. People look at Jordan Peterson like, wow, he's setting the world on fire. 3 million books. 3 million is nothing. And Jordan Peterson, 5 years from now, will he be remembered? And I'm not going to list a list of names that I'm thinking of who were a very big deal 5 or 10 years ago, and where are they now? It's the way these things go. These are long movements, and the world is big. The challenges we face move far faster. I've been doing this for a year and a half, 2 years, and if you read, for example, if you think Jordan Peterson is big, read the Discord book about Luther and Erasmus and the Protestant Reformation. That was like a match on wildfire. Boy, that thing spread fast and just disrupted the world. And if you've ever been in a time and a place when things get disrupted quickly, most of the time it's no fun. We're encouraged by good faith conversations across ancient tribal lines, and that's why sometimes in the comment section when people get real tribal, let's keep talking to each other. That's what talk is for. And let's keep smiling, and let's keep shaking hands, and let's not keep pouncing on tribal or enforcing tribal borders too quickly. Let's have conversations. Let's work through this. Let's talk. Let's be generous towards one another. Because none of us are as smart or as wise as we should be, and all of us are living a lot less and a lot shorter than we want. I'm going to, right after I finish doing this, I'm going to do my sermon, my rough draft for my sermon on Mark Farrer, the parable of the soils and the plows, because it's not all of our best intentions and all of our direct intentional efforts that build the kinds of things that we want right away. Well, often it's the things that we don't expect, and the catastrophes that and the interventions that we can't foresee. And that's usually how we stumble into the future. So, understanding Jordan Peterson through the meaning crisis. I have a much better understanding of the Jordan Peterson phenomenon than I had last year. And I think the bigger frame is the meaning crisis. And through the meaning crisis, we can now integrate some other conversations with John Vervaeke and cognitive science. And you know, again, Jordan Peterson was the match that set this thing off in some ways. I never would have found Jonathan Peugeot or Struan or John Vervaeke or Malcolm Guite or Mark Vernon or Owen Barfield. I knew C.S. Lewis, but I never would have found all this without Peterson. And so I think that the better, bigger frame from which to understand Peterson is this meaning crisis. And I know some of you complain whenever I have Jordan Peterson in the title. Am I clickbaiting? Am I, but the Peterson story is not done yet. And he needs some space for his family. He should be given that space. He's going to be doing some writing. We'll see if he ever gets around to Exodus. We don't know what the future holds. And so, yeah, but I think, again, the meaning crisis is the bigger frame, and I think perhaps a more helpful frame, and we'll see where this goes. So leave a comment. I said leave a comment, subscribe, I should say all those things as a YouTuber. Also, again, in the notes down below here, there's a link to a Discord server, and I didn't know what any of this is. And this is, again, why this is so exciting, because someone else set this up. I didn't know about this, and, Bridges of Meaning, Joey is putting together with a whole bunch of other people that you'll recognize from the comments section, and they've got logos, and they've kind of logos, and they've kind of got a framework, and they're piecing this thing together. And the goal of all of this is meaningful conversation, where let's create spaces where real people can come together. And this is what we've been doing at the Jordan Peterson meetups. We had a meetup, the last meetup here. We broke up into two groups, and one group, because we had a bunch of new people that hadn't done much Jordan Peterson talk, that conversation in that group talked about Jordan Peterson, and one guy at the end of it says, "This is my fourth meeting here, and the first time we talked about Jordan Peterson." And again, I'm not saying about, I'm just recognizing that it's part of a much larger conversation, and we need to figure out, and these are institutional questions, we need to figure out how to facilitate these conversations. And it takes stewarding. It takes not, we're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about this. This is how we talk about politics, not like that. This is how we talk about the issues of the day, not like that. This is how we treat people. We don't treat people like that. These are the practices, the institutional practices that will facilitate all of the stuff that John Vervaeke has some really cool words for, that I haven't sufficiently mastered, or so that they will trip off my tongue like they trip off John's. But yeah, leave a comment, join the Discord server, follow me on Twitter. I've been doing a lot more on Twitter than on Facebook, just because it's so much more efficient. We're all left to smaller bites. So anyway, yeah, thanks for watching.